Well, welcome to Authors at Your Library. I'm Michael Steinmacher, the director of the Barr Memorial Library at Fort Knox, Kentucky. Tonight, we are privileged to host our friend David Bell. David is a professor of English at Western Kentucky University, and he is the author of many great thrillers. Tonight, we're going to be talking to him about his newest book, but first of all, I'd like to say welcome to David.
Hey, how are you? It's good to see you again.
Good to see you too. Hopefully, the next time we do this, we'll be live and in person. You've done a number of great events for us at Fort Knox, and we'd look forward to welcoming you back.
Well, it's always a treat to go up there. You always have such a good crowd, and you really know how to treat authors well and make them feel welcome. And that's what writers appreciate is librarians and bookstores who know how to treat the writer and make them feel welcome. And you guys always do a great job of that.
Well, I appreciate you saying that. So, first of all, would you tell us a little bit about your new book?
Yeah, Kill All Your Darlings, which came out earlier this summer, is a suspense novel. And like all my other books, it's a suspense novel and it tells the story of a creative writing professor at a university in Kentucky who, when one of his students disappears, he takes her manuscript and passes it off as his own in order to get tenure, only to find out that the manuscript implicates him in an unsolved murder in the town. And then things get worse for him from there.
So, wow. So, you start off with an ethically challenged professor and move into murder and murder that he may be implicated in. And
Well, ethically challenged professor is a repetitive statement, I think, sometimes. So, Um, but yeah, he initially it's just his quest to get tenure, and then it ends up dragging him into the middle of a murder investigation concerning a murder that he hadn't even known had been committed in the town.
so, where did the idea for this one come from? Or where do your ideas come from in general?
Well, this one, it, I have tried a couple of different times to write a book about a college professor because that's what I do by day. And so I had wanted to write a thriller set on a college campus about a creative writing professor and that creative writing professor's interaction with one of his students. And so I had tried a couple different times to get that story to work and had not really been able to get it fully off the ground. There wasn't enough of a story there, or my editor and people like that just weren't excited yet with the direction that it was going. And then I added the element to the story of there being, so you have the professor and the student and the manuscript and all that. And then I added the element to the story of there being a scandal in the English department concerning a professor sexually harassing female students. And that's when the book was really came together and there was enough of a story there to tell. So it took a while, it took a couple of false starts, but then it finally came together that way. And it's the you asked where I usually get the ideas from. I get them from all kinds of places. I get them from news stories, or I get them from things people tell me, or things I observe, or things I just totally make up. But all the other times that I've written books, since I've never really written about a creative writing professor, I've always had to imagine a job for the main character because the main character has to have something to do. They have to be doing something. And so this was the one, and I don't know what people do for jobs. Like I don't know enough about that to know what other people do in the world. So that was always a source of difficulty for me, was imagining what other people do for a living. So this time I didn't have to do that because I was writing about a creative writing professor. So I knew a lot about his job and what he did for a living. So that part was easy this time.
So, do you think that had anything to do with why it was a little more challenging to get this one off the ground?
Yeah, that's an interesting question because I I think we naturally think that if we write about something that's familiar to us, and if we write about a world that is familiar to us, it will be easier. But in a way, I imagine in some ways it's harder to do when we try to write about something about ourselves, right? Because how clearly do we see ourselves? How clearly do we see the world that's right under our nose every day? So yeah, maybe it was that. Um, More than anything, I think it was just in the past, the other attempts I made at the book, like I said, they just didn't have enough going on. They weren't quite as commercial or as appealing as they needed to be. Maybe they were dealing a little too much with stuff about publishing or stuff about academia that other people just may not be interested in. So I had to figure out a way to make the story more appealing in a general sense, and I think that's what happened.
Is there something you need to, as a common element or a key element to launch your storytelling? Do you have to have a plot? Do you have to have a character? Can it be a combination? I guess where I'm coming from is where do you find your jumping off point, or is it more of the idea you have a whole plot in mind before you start?
Well, it usually starts with just a little germ of an idea, and I think of it as the what if game. It's kind of like when we're kids and we play make believe, or we do stuff and we say, like, oh, what if we were doing this, or what if we were on a pirate ship, or what if we were in space, or what if we were on a submarine. Um, it starts with that what if situation where, as a writer, I just say, so what if there was a character in this situation? And so really it does kind of have to begin with the character, and then put them in a difficult situation, and a situation where there can be enough trouble for that character that will last 350 pages. There are some ideas that don't have enough trouble to last that long. So it has to be enough of a difficult situation that this character is going to take, a good 350, 400 pages to figure it out. So, but it starts with that what if? What if someone's in this situation? What would they do? How would they respond? Usually they have to get themselves deeper into trouble, right? They can't resolve the trouble quickly. They have to get themselves more deeply into trouble. And it just kind of goes from there. One thing leads to another from there.
So I'm curious if you've thought about how your work as a novelist has evolved over time. Is that something you've thought about, or if you haven't, what's your initial reaction to that?
Well, to some extent, it's really difficult to know how things have changed for me, simply because I can't ever see it objectively. I wish I could see my own writing completely objectively, but I just can't. It's impossible to do. And I don't think anybody can really do that as writers or any other creative person. In the same way that we can't even look at ourselves in the mirror in the morning and be objective about it, right? Like if I look at myself in the mirror, I'm going to notice, oh, I have this little mark on my nose, or oh, I have this little thing with my hair, or whatever, that someone else may not even care about. So it's very difficult to see our own writing objectively. If I were to attempt to step back and say that, I do think that over the years I have tried to learn, and I think I've become better at making the books more fast paced, making the books more suspenseful, and I really think that's just practice of doing it over and over again, and learning some tricks of the trade, and getting to the point where I instinctively know how to do that. And also the other thing that I think happens, the more I write, and probably the more anybody writes, is that um, I I have more confidence in myself. that I know when I face the blank page that something is going to happen, right? That something is going to come out. And so I think that's gotten better over the years, and maybe that happens to everybody over the years.
Can you tell us a little bit about your writing process?
Yeah, well, like I said, it starts with that what if thing, right? And then it moves from there to, well, the way it happens now that I'm working with an editor and I have books under contract is that I will come up with those initial situations, and I will maybe write just like a 1 or 2 sentence summary of the book, of the idea for the book, and maybe do that for a few books, for a few things, and I will send those to my editor, and I will say which one of these is most exciting to you. The one thing that if anybody out there is a writer and they're thinking of trying to get published is books really only work and become successful if people in the publishing house are excited about them. And the sooner you get them excited about it, the more success you're going to have, because those people need to buy in from the very beginning. So I go through that process with my editor because I want her to be interested from the very beginning. I want her to give her feedback from the very beginning. I want anybody else at the publishing house who she might talk to be interested and excited at the very beginning. And so when they pick one of those ideas from the at the very beginning based on just 1 or 2 sentences, once they've settled on one and they say, yeah, this is the one we think is most exciting, most wonderful, whatever, then from there I develop it into a longer, an outline, a summary of the book. And those can be 6 or 8 pages, all the way up to 20 or 22 pages, depending on depending on the book and depending on how many questions there are to answer and everything. And so that long outline process for me is a way to answer a lot of questions up front. In a way, it that functions as a first draft so that any questions, like, well, halfway through the book, the main character gets thrown in jail. How are you going to get him out of jail? Or like in 3/4 of the way through the book, the killer has the main character tied to the railroad tracks. How are they going to get off the railroad tracks? Answer all those questions in the outline so that when it comes to actually writing the first draft of the book, many of those questions have been answered. So then it's writing the first draft and it's getting feedback from various people. My wife, Molly, who's a writer, my editor, my agent, all those people who give good feedback on the book, and then revising it multiple times and getting it all the way to the finish line.
So I'm curious, you obviously, as you engage your editor early on and give her those 1 or 2 sentence ideas for them to consider, she picks one. What happens to those other ones?
What does happen to those other ones? My editor has a thing where sometimes once, maybe she just hates the other ones, I don't know. But sometimes it feels like once she's seen an idea, it goes away for a while. Like she doesn't want to see that idea again. But I have been able to go back before. If an idea, I guess this is a good thing to think about as a writer, is um, in the process of deciding what to write about, if there's an idea that someone cannot stop thinking about, so if you're a writer and you have an idea and you're not sure if it's a book or a story or whatever, but you cannot stop thinking about it, 6 months go by, a year goes by, and you still keep thinking about that story, I think that's a good sign that that's a story that you really want to write and maybe you really need to write. So for me, sometimes those ideas that get rejected, they just kind of fade from my mind too, and I don't really think about them again, and I don't really remember what they were about, which probably means there's a reason why they didn't get picked. They just weren't that exciting to anybody. Um, but sometimes there are ideas that stick around, that stick in my brain, and a year later or 2 years later, I'm still thinking like, well, what about that? Could we make that work? I mean, that happened with Kill All Your Darlings. Like I said, that I'd tried this before. It didn't quite work, but I wasn't able to entirely let go of of that idea, and I came back to it. So sometimes those do come back, or sometimes parts of them come back and they're reshaped into something else. Sometimes my editor kind of acts like, hey, I've seen that before, and it's like last year's clothing or whatever. It's time to send it to the remainder bin and move on. So it just depends. I guess it really depends on how good the idea is and how much it's grabbed somebody.
Well, you mentioned at the beginning of this conversation that you wrote about this time about a creative writing professor, and that that's something that and you also mentioned how that's different from some of the other situations that you've created over the years. Can you tell me a little bit about what type of research might go into any given book?
Yeah, I mean, I feel like the research that I do into a book, it first there's a couple different kinds of research. There's like ongoing my ongoing interest in crime stories and weird news stories and missing persons cases and murders and serial killers and all that, and and abnormal psychology and all those things that even if I weren't writing books about it, I would be reading about that because it's interesting to me. And long before I wrote books, like when I was 10 years old, and I would be fascinated by serial killers or stories like that. Um, I was a strange kid, is what I'm trying to say, or maybe I was a normal kid. I don't know. But just the ongoing interest in those things, and those things that I would be reading about or interested in, whatever was going on in my life. That's always just going on. That's always just happening, right? And then there's the specific research that happens in a specific project. So if I'm writing a book and I get to a point, like for instance, I can just think of one example where I was writing a book. You'll be surprised. I was writing a book and somebody died in the book, right? And so I, but in a town like, so I live in Bowling Green, and so in a town this size, I wasn't sure. I grew up in Cincinnati, which was a big city, and so Cincinnati had, its own coroner and its own morgue, and they did autopsies there and all that. But I didn't know what was that like in a town the size of Bowling Green, say. And I had to know that to advance the story because someone was dead and family members were going to identify the body. And I just had to know how that worked. And fortunately, my next door neighbor is a retired police officer here in Bowling Green. And I asked him, and I was like, well, what happens? And he told me how it happens here in Bowling Green. And so that's the kind of specific question that might come up. What happens when this happens? And the story can't really go forward until I know the answer to that question. So to me, I see those as the two kinds of research. There's like the ongoing, constantly reading, researching, thinking about these things. And then when someone gets in the middle of the book and some question comes up that the writer didn't anticipate. I didn't know this was going to be a problem. I didn't know this was going to happen in the book, or I didn't know that I didn't know this thing, and now I have to know what happens. And the writer might have to stop and find out the answer. And maybe it's an easy answer to find out because nowadays we have the internet and you can just like look up a lot of stuff, or you'd have to know the person to call. Or if you live next door to a retired police officer, that also helps. Or it might take a little while. You're kind of wandering around trying to figure out who you need to ask. But those are the two ways that I think it works for me anyway.
So, staying in this same line of thinking, what kind of challenges beyond that kind of plot moving forward challenge do you feel like you face consistently when you're writing?
I think the big challenge, and probably any writer who's written multiple books faces this challenge, is that who's a writer who's written multiple books in the same genre, I think faces this challenge, which is you can't repeat yourself too much or at all. And if you think about the kinds of books I write, which are suspense novels, and they're always about, somebody's getting kidnapped, somebody's getting murdered, somebody's stolen something, whatever. All that stuff is happening in these books. And I've really thought about this a lot. And I think, what are the reasons why people commit these crimes in life? Why do people tend to murder other people or harm other people or kidnap other people? And there are really a limited number of reasons why those horrible crimes happen. Usually it's a crime of passion. It centers around love or love gone wrong or love misunderstood or love misplaced or some warped version of love. Or a lot of times it's money and property. Somebody stole something, somebody wants money, somebody stole a car, somebody stole a whatever. And so there are a limited number of reasons why these things happen. So, and then honestly, there are a limited number of ways that we can kill other people, right? I mean, like, we live in a culture where whatever your beliefs are, there are lots of guns, there are lots of knives, there are lots of ways to harm people. We have weapons right here on our hands. So there's a challenge to say, okay, there's a limited number of reasons why people commit horrible crimes. There's a limited number of ways to commit horrible crimes, or there are certain ways to commit these horrible crimes which are more readily available to people than others, right? I mean, I guess you could go out and get, a rapier or something like that, or a cutlass and stab somebody, but it's easier to get a gun in our culture. It's easier to beat somebody in our culture. So given those limited constraints of reality, writers have to dress up other parts of the story. That's where the characters come in. Are the characters dynamic and interesting? Are the characters unique? Is the setting unique? Like, say, setting a book on a college campus or whatever. Is that a more unique setting? Those are the challenges. And I've had the same editor for all 12 books that I've done with Berkeley, which is a good thing because it's steady and reliable. It's also a bad thing because she remembers everything. So, like, she'll read a book in one of my manuscripts and say, oh, it was 3 books ago you murdered somebody with a hammer. So, like, you can't murder somebody with a hammer now. Or it was like, 5 books ago, they stuffed the body in a garbage can. So you've got to stuff the body somewhere else. So those become the limitations. I think the more somebody writes, the more it stretches. You have to stretch yourself to figure out a way to do these things uniquely.
You mentioned the idea of dynamic characters. I'm curious if your characters ever do anything you didn't anticipate they would do.
Yeah, I think they do. I mean, first of all, for instance, in Kill All Your Darlings, there are 3 point of view characters. There's Connor, the English professor, who's stolen the manuscript. There is Madeline, who is the missing student who had her manuscript stolen. And then there's a 3rd point of view character, Rebecca, who's another student at the university. When I wrote the outline for the book, I knew Rebecca was going to be in there, but I didn't think she was going to play a particularly large role in the story. I didn't think she was going to be a point of view character. But as I started to write the book, I realized Rebecca had a larger role to play in the story. And all of a sudden, I was writing from Rebecca's point of view in the book and added that point of view to the book. So that's an example of a character who I thought was going to play a smaller role in the book. And all of a sudden, she was playing a larger role in the book, and she was showing up in different places that I hadn't anticipated her showing up. And it's part of that is I think part of that is difficult to explain logically. It comes up from, it's like dreaming. It comes up from someone's subconscious, and all of a sudden, this character, this thing is insisting on coming out. Part of it is also a little logical. I mean, there were practical reasons to have her doing more in the book. She's probably one of the few very normal characters in the whole book, so it was nice to have a normal character in the book. But so it's a combination of things, I think, where we can plan for things and they come up. But yeah, definitely sometimes characters end up playing larger roles in the story than we thought. Sometimes as I'm writing, I get to a point and a character who I thought was going to remain less three-dimensional than other characters, takes on a different aspect. They do something interesting. They do something surprising. I wasn't aware that was going to happen, but it feels right for the book. And I think that's one of the most exciting things about writing is when something happens like that that I hadn't anticipated and that surprises me.
So you mentioned earlier you don't feel like, and I'm paraphrasing a little bit, that looking at your work you can necessarily be objective about the work you've done in the past and your current work from your own perspective. But I'm curious if you could step back in time, back to the beginning when you were working on that first book. What would David Bell tell that David Bell that you a lesson that you've learned that you think would have been valuable to know early on?
Huh. That's a good question. Do you have a time machine like that that I can use or this? Oh, I thought maybe. I
No,
thought maybe you had one
if
tucked
you
away
did,
in the library.
if you did, we'd be Sherman and Peabody going back in time.
Okay. And we'd be like buying what Amazon stock or Apple stock or
Absolutely,
something like that. We'd be making
absolutely.
lots of money. Yeah. Yeah, I would probably go back in time and tell him to relax a little bit. That it is going to work out, right? Because back then I didn't know that this was all going to work out. I didn't know how it was going to work, and and I really did, and probably most writers feel this way. I lived with a lot of fear and anxiety that it was never going to work out, that I was wasting my time, that I wasn't talented enough, that I wasn't going to catch the right break, that no one was ever going to see one of my books published. And so that would be the main thing, is to go back in time and say, just take a deep breath, relax, stick with this, it'll be okay. But I also think that some of that um, anxiety and fear that people feel early on in any career, I would imagine. I mean, it's not limited to people who are writers or creative people. I think anybody who is dedicated to a career, when they start out, they're terrified a little bit that this might not work out. I might not get a job. I might not do well. I might not get promoted, blah, blah, blah. Some of that fear and anxiety, I think, is a little motivating, obviously, and that fuels us to keep going and keep trying and all that. So, I wouldn't want to completely get rid of that, but maybe a little of it so that I could be a little more relaxed back then.
So I learned a long time ago not to ask the question of whether or not an author reads their reviews because you either get an equivocal yes or you get an equivocal no. So I'm curious what you do with reader feedback. Does that shape or inform your work in any way?
Yeah, it doesn't really, I don't think, shape or inform anything. Well, I mean, it informs. I don't think it shapes. It informs, and usually it's just stuff that sometimes readers, like on Goodreads or Amazon or wherever, um, they might say something that I know. Like they might say, oh, the 15th chapter, the pace was really slow, or oh, it felt like this character wasn't fully developed. And I might be able to look back at that and say, well, I understand why that wasn't quite true, or that didn't quite come together the way I wanted it to, or whatever. I mean, that's after I've thrown my computer across the room, of course. Like I do that first, and then um, I handle it very maturely, is what I'm saying. But no, sometimes readers say things that I think are pretty accurate. I mean, let's face it, most readers who post those reviews are pretty voracious readers, and they've read a lot of books, and they're pretty smart, and usually they've read a lot of books in the genre, and that's part of the reason why, to go back to the question where we were talking about, there are only so many ways to kill somebody and so many ways to do this. readers have seen all the tricks. If they've been reading mystery novels and thrillers for a long time, they've seen all the tricks. They know, they can anticipate, oh, this is the bad guy, this is the person who's going to kill them, right? Whatever, blah blah blah. So part of that is it gets increasingly difficult to fool readers who read a lot. So of course, sometimes readers say things that I think are relatively accurate, or are dead on, and if sometimes people say things that seem out of left field or strange, or like, you get the Amazon reviews where they say, 1 star because my book came with page 72 folded over and I hate that. And it's like, well, that doesn't have anything to do with me, right? I think we have to learn to block those things out. If you ever look at those reviews, you can see that, look at any book that is really successful and has been well reviewed or whatever, there are lots of people trashing those books on Amazon, Goodreads, whatever, even classic books, great books, whatever. So that's just part of like the democratic process. Some people are not going to like your book. It's okay. Life goes on. I don't know that I really learn that much from it, because I don't know that anyone ever says anything that maybe I haven't thought of, or someone else hasn't said, or that my editor wasn't concerned about, or whatever the case may be. But it's there. It's part of the process these days.
So, what do you read when you're not writing?
I try to read a little bit of everything. I try to read across genres because, I don't. I know there are some people. I mean, I encounter people who say that they just read in one genre. Oh, I just read mysteries. I just read romance. I just read this. I, I don't understand that. I would get restless if I was just reading in one genre or one kind of book. And just because I like reading different things, and I think there's something to learn from all different kinds of books and stories. So I try to read a lot of different things. I even try to read things that are not at all like what I would write. I mean, I think reading, for instance, the New Yorker or the newspaper, where you have really good journalists writing stories, and they write very clearly and concisely, and can very clearly and simply set a scene and explain something to the reader. I think that's really valuable writing to read, because that's what we're all trying to do, is clearly and concisely communicate with other people as writers. So I try to read a lot of different stuff. Maybe it's also just that my attention span has diminished as I've gotten older, so I want to jump around between a lot of different things. I don't know.
So, kind of to wrap this up, you mentioned the fact that Kill All Your Darlings came out a few months ago. Your books tend to be summertime reads. So, where are you in the creative process now for what's coming up?
Well, so the book that's coming out next summer from Berkeley, I have turned in the first, just a few weeks ago, I turned in the first big revision to my editor. So I turned it in May, I guess it was. My editor read it, gave me a bunch of feedback on it. I addressed those revisions this summer, and I turned it back into her. So any day now, she's going to get back in touch with me and say, we still need to work on a few little things, or I'm still curious about this, that, or the other thing. So that's basically it. And then, so next year I have 2 books coming out.
Hmm.
I have an adult book coming out in the summer with Berkeley called The Finalists. That's a locked room story, also set on a college campus. It's a small private college, and a wealthy donor gives a lucrative scholarship every year. But in order to compete for the scholarship, you have to be locked in a house on campus and take a test. And spoiler alert, some people start to die once they get locked in the house. Otherwise, it wouldn't be exciting. So that's coming out next summer. It's called The Finalists. And then next fall, meaning the fall of 2022, so over a year from now, my first young adult suspense novel is coming out from Source Books. And so I'm about to get into the revision process on that one too. So I'll be revising that one this fall, probably doing more revising on the next book for Berkeley. So it's going to be the fall of revision, I guess, is what we'll
That's
be calling it.
that's interesting. What interested you in the young adult genre?
Well, I've read a fair amount over the years, and I've also just that period in life of being a teenager, being in high school, is such a formative time, and it is so strongly imprinted, I think, on all of us, whether it was good or bad. And for most of us, it was probably some combination of both. And it's interesting that it's a time in life that I think a lot of us look back on and think, I would never go back to high school. I would never do that again. But yet it's very vivid in our minds, maybe more than college, more than graduate school, more than the 20s. That time is imprinted on us. So I'm just kind of fascinated by that time period in life. I wanted to write more. I had been trying to, this was a few years ago, I had been coming up with a new idea, working on that outline for a new book. And I had come up with an idea for a book that I thought was for adults, where it was told in two timelines, the timeline when the guy was an adult and the timeline when he was in high school. I realized all the interesting stuff was happening when he was in high school. All the stuff was happening in the past when his girlfriend disappeared and he was accused of the murder. And so I thought, maybe I have a young adult book here, a young adult suspense book. And I started writing it with no expectations that I would finish it. I had no idea what would happen. I didn't know if I could do it. But it really just it did work, and it just came, and I was very happy with it. So I'm excited for that book to come out.
All
And
right.
everybody can start saving their pennies, since it's still over a year away before it comes out.
Well, and it's a double David Bell kind of 2022 too.
It will. It will be the year of David Bell in 2022.
It's always the year with David Bell when you're in the room with us.
Well, and maybe we'll be in the room together next year. Maybe by then we'll be able to do more things in person or something like that. I certainly hope so.
Absolutely. David, it's been a pleasure as always. Thanks for talking to us tonight.
Thank you for having me on, and good luck up there at Fort Knox. And yeah, I do look forward to seeing everybody up there in person sometime. So thanks a lot.
Thank you. We look forward to seeing you again, and we hope that you will join us for another author event in the near future. Thanks.